David, one of the principles of holistic management and the grazing involved is rest periods. And can you tell us about why rest is important, what it actually is, what we're talking about, and the ways that you manage or it can be managed?
Sure. Yeah, they're fundamental, Charlie. I guess probably the way to talk about it is in two parts. There's planning grazing in the growing season, so that's after the opening rains, usually in the autumn. You can have a growing season at any time of the year, but mostly in most districts you have a somewhat defined season. Mostly here we get some rain in the autumn. It's a chancy time of the year for rain, but mostly we do get it sometime between March and June. So then things start growing. The perennials fire up as soon as it rains. The annuals germinate and start growing. They grow through the winter and then die in the summer. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to, in the growing season plan, it's what's called an open plan because you don't know when it's going to finish. So you can't predict when the rain and the season is going to become dormant. So, and the planning in the growing season is all about recovery. Okay. Now, recovery is from the time you graze the plant to when the stock come back to it. And you don't want to come back to it in the growing season until it is fully recovered. Now that's a subjective judgment really. In the spring, in late October, in a normal spring where it's wet, recovery can be 30 to 40 to 50 days. Now, what is a recovered plant? That's another question that's no one can actually tell you, but the rule of thumb is that if a plant looks as though it hasn't been grazed, it's probably recovered. When plants are growing fast, you need to be moving quickly because if you stay there for more than 3 days in quick growth, you'll be grazing plants that are trying to recover from energy they've stored in their grounds. You don't want to do that because that damages the plant and weakens it. So you want to allow enough time for the plant to fully recover before you graze it again. Now when growth is slow, you can stay for longer in a paddock because it'll take longer for the plants that animals grazed on the first day to get big enough for them to graze before they leave that paddock. So in slow growth you could maybe stay in a paddock for perhaps up to a week before you'd be grazing leaves that are growing from plant reserves. Okay, so how much recovery do you need? Well, what we do is if you've got less than 100 paddocks, you probably need to plan for 2 recovery periods. So you need a recovery period for fast growth and a recovery period for slow growth. And what we generally plan for is in the growing season is a fast recovery period of 50 days. That's very conservative because sometimes it's quicker than that. And what you plan on the chart for your grazing plan is not set in stone. You'll use your own judgment. So if growth is quicker than 50 days recovery, and you can see that by looking at the paddocks that you've come out of, they show you immediately what the growth rate is because you'll see leaves appearing very quickly. 50 days we say it's better to be conservative than to be too high in the stirrups and punting on grass. It's a really big no-no is to punt on what you think might happen. It's okay to deal with what is reality, but you get into dangerous territory if you start guessing about what the season's going to do before it's done it. So 50 days short recovery when things are growing fast, very conservative, and then 150 days when growth is slower. So that means 5 months before animals will be back in that paddock. Now to get that amount of recovery you need quite a lot of paddocks. Here we've got 2 mobs running at the moment. In really bad drought conditions it's very advantageous to have 1 mob because it takes a lot longer to get around the place. But we've been able to manage for a long period of time with 2 mobs, about 50 paddocks each. So that means in slow growth with 50 paddocks you could have 3 days grazing, unlikely to do any damage. You won't be grazing plants that are recovering, and 3 days times 50 paddocks is 150 days. So if it gets really bad, like it did in 2002 to 2010, you might have to change your recovery period. You might have to say, well, actually we need longer than that. We might have to go up to 200 days. So, but if you do that, you'd have to recalculate the whole chart. Now there are bits of software around today that make that a lot simpler than, or quicker perhaps, than doing it on paper. I do it on paper because it suits me. I've got 18 years of continuous grazing charts. There's not many people that have got that many. I just find you can't keep it in your head. So there's a few calculations you do. They're very simple. There's if you're a holistic management trainee, you've got a thing called an aid memoir, which you just follow. It leads you through the steps that will enable you to create a grazing chart, and then you start excuse me, then you start moving your animals, and that's when your judgment comes in. So if it's a fast growth period, fast growth doesn't happen for very long generally. After rain you'll get a spurt of growth, but then it'll tail off within a week to 10 days if it doesn't rain again. Also when growth is slow, and this is what we're looking at here really, is this paddock hasn't been grazed for 150 days, so that's the recovery this paddock has had in the coldest, driest winter we've experienced in nearly 50 years. So you can see that a lot of feed has grown, even though it's been pretty ordinary conditions. If we had stock in here all the time, there'd be hardly any grass in here at all. It'd be like a dead lawn, almost like a dead lawn.